The share it with a friend deal, even if that friend is yourself. Your McDonald's, your rules.
Live your best morning with BOGO breakfast sandwiches only on the McDonald's app. Now buy one bacon, egg, and cheese McGriddles or sausage, egg, and cheese McGriddles and get a second one free. Valid for item of equal or lesser value. Limited time only at participating McDonald's. Valid one per day. Excludes $1, $2, $3 menu. Visit McDonald's app for details. Download and registration required.
Ba-da-ba-ba-ba.
Game over, man. Game over.
You're gonna need a bigger boat.
I am Iron Man.
This is a tasty burger.
Welcome to the InSession Film Podcast.
Welcome to this podcast review for February 28th, 2023. I'm JD Duran.
And I'm Brendan Cassidy.
Thanks for joining us, everybody. Brendan, are you ready to talk about the snow brewing?
I don't know. I really don't know about that. I'm ready to talk about Cocaine Bear. That's what I'm ready to talk about.
Or Cocaine Bear, that's another way to phrase it. That is the movie that we're here to talk about. And this is going to be interesting, Brendan, because obviously this ties into episode 523 that we just did on the main podcast this last week. We all knew what we were walking into with Cocaine Bear being this campy, schlocky, trashy movie, if you will. We'll talk about...
Is it, though?
Well, yeah,
Is it, though?
We'll talk about whether it's successful in that or not. Here's the other thing, too, and I kind of want to start off this conversation with this. This story, the film is loosely, very, very loosely based off of a real story, as a lot of you know, which has a lot of ties to Lexington, Kentucky.
That's true. That is very true.
So Andrew C. Thornton II, which is the guy that you see at the beginning of the film, who is dumping all of the cocaine out of the plane and into the forest there. He was a former police... he was in the police department in Lexington, Kentucky, part of the narcotics unit there. So that's one tie to Lexington. And then here's the other thing, too. So Pablo Escobar, as he's come to be known by, and that is just an incredible name. It's like whoever came up with that, kudos. Fantastic.
Why wasn't that in this movie?
I don't know, but Pablo Escobar, very, very well done. So
that might be the greatest dad joke of all time.
They didn't want to just bury the bear because
I see what you did.
Yeah, they didn't want to bury it. Yeah.
We're full of them today.
I know, all kinds of bear puns. We'll see if any of this continues as we go here.
I don't think so.
But they didn't want this to just go by the wayside, so they taxidermied Pablo Escobar, and he is in the Kentucky for Kentucky Fun Mall in Lexington. Have you been to that mall? Have you seen Pablo Escobar?
I have not seen Pablo Escobar, but I have been to that mall, though. I guess I have not been paying attention, I guess, in my time when I was living there.
Well, and this is why I wanted to bring it up. So for context, and I probably should have started with this, Brendan and I, when we first met, we were both living in Lexington, Kentucky.
Yep. Met at West 6 Brewing, specifically.
Really great. I lived there for the better part of 8 years, something to that effect. I was in Lexington for quite a while. And like you, I have also been to this mall. I have seen this bear. However, until recently, had no idea who that bear was.
So basically, this is all of a sudden a nostalgic masterpiece for you.
Well, it was hilarious. You hear about the story, what this film is based off, and it is compelling. I do see the appeal of why they wanted to do this movie. And then you start reading about the backstory of it. The bear has this incredible nickname. You learn about Andrew C. Thornton II and all the details that go into it. You learn that they taxidermy the bear. It's in this mall in Lexington. And then all of a sudden I start to see pictures of the taxidermy bear in that mall. And I'm like, wait a second. I know that spot. I've seen that bear before, but I did not, I really never made that. I never took any time to learn about why this taxidermy bear is in this mall. I had no clue.
The story is fascinating, especially having our own, historical ties to it. Not the story, but the sense of place that we're talking about specifically. And I would love to see a movie that's more literally historical, because from what I understand, the movie that we got here is really just taking that premise and turning it into a B monster movie, essentially. Because I think in real life, this bear did cocaine and then it just died or something like that.
So I do have some information about that I wanted to read off here, because you're right. The story is compelling. Andrew C. Thornton II, as we see at the beginning of the film, not verbatim what we see, but more or less, right? He dumps all this cocaine out of this plane. He jumps out. His parachute fails. He dies.
Not giving us the Americans reunion we thought we were getting.
No. But here's some information. And my source here, Wikipedia. Thought that was a little bit appropriate.
It's valid. It's valid.
Thought that was appropriate to this movie.
The movie quotes Wikipedia in the first 3 minutes.
Exactly. That's why I wanted to bring this up. So, quote, the containers held about 75 pounds, 34 kilograms of cocaine, valued at $2 million. And by the time the scene was studied by government authorities, all of the containers had been ripped open with their contents scattered. The chief medical examiner from the Georgia State Crime Lab, Dr. Kenneth Alonzo, stated that its stomach, speaking of Pablo Escobar, its stomach was quote, literally packed to the brim with cocaine, end quote.
Wow.
Pretty insane. And then, I've watched a few videos of like animal experts. I'm sure there's a phrase that's not coming to me at the moment. Zoologist. I'm not sure what their titles are, but I've heard people talking about, like, from an animal perspective, that for Pablo Escobar, it would have been quite traumatic and horrific. So
no wonder he's so angry.
Well, and so it's kind of this weird thing where if they were to treat this material with, let's say, a genuine tone, not going to be easy to watch. I think it'll turn off a lot of viewers because the bear is going to suffer quite heavily. It was not a fun end, not a fun death for him as the film depicts. It is quite
getting
different.
Morbid. This is not the kind of conversation I thought we would have about Cocaine Bear.
No, it was. They say it would have been quite harrowing, and it wouldn't have been the fun escapade that is depicted in this movie, which is probably why the film was like, "Hey, this is a compelling story," but instead of depicting it genuinely and this bear, experiencing this awful death, let's flip that coin and make him go on this rampage, killing a bunch of people and having fun and not dying at the end. Spoiler alert.
At least the movie seems to be self-aware of that. So any zoologists don't feel the urge to, I guess, study this movie and say how inaccurate that it is scientifically, because the movie seems to know that for sure.
Well, yeah, and I think it was marketed that way, that it was going to be
that's the
schlocky,
point I'm making.
B movie.
Yeah, the movie, like, just because of its choice of genre, and Elizabeth Banks and her choice of genre here, it's pretty clear that they're aware of the true nature of what happened to Pablo Escobar.
Yeah, exactly.
So
yeah,
it makes
100%.
sense.
Yeah, I completely agree. All right, well, with that, I guess we can transition into the film. As you noted, directed by Elizabeth Banks. It stars Kerry Russell, O'Shea Jackson Jr., Alden Ehrenreich, Isaiah Whitlock Jr., Ray Liotta, his last appearance on film. And I have to admit, when I saw his name come up in the opening credits, I choked up a little bit. I had completely forgotten about that when I walked into the theater.
Would have been nice to see more of him. I'll just come up and say that right now.
Yeah, I agree. And of course, the last one here, Brooklyn Prince. Oh,
I thought
my gosh.
I had no idea you didn't know she was in this movie.
Idea. I mean, I had seen bits of that original teaser or the original trailer that dropped. But beyond that, the only other marketing I saw was the poster, which I loved. I thought the poster was really great for a schlocky movie like this. So I didn't really pay attention. I didn't look up the cast. I didn't know who all was in it, aside from those who I recognized in the little bits of the trailer that I had seen. And I knew that it was a schlocky version of these events. That's really all that I knew. Yeah. I had no idea Brooklyn Prince was in. Like, I was in the theater. I had looked up some stuff regarding the film on IMDb as I was waiting for the movie to begin. And I saw her name. And I was like, oh my God, Brooklyn Prince is this movie. I had no idea. And then the moment we see her first pop up on screen early on in the film, I legit almost cried. Like, I was so excited to see her again.
It just made me want to go back and watch the Florida Project.
Oh my gosh. Yeah. So it was really wonderful to see her. Yeah. Well, I'm sure we'll talk more about her as we go here. I don't know if I need to give a synopsis. We sort of talked about that already. Cocaine a bear ingests a ton of cocaine. That's what it is.
Yeah.
So Brendan, what did you think of Cocaine Bear?
So we talked about this on our last main show. We talked about our favorite movies that are complete trash.
Yeah.
Or like our favorite trashy movies, and Cocaine Bear was the inspiration for that. And especially within the realm of these schlocky B horror movies, monster movies, animal attack movies, if you will. And I bring that up because some of our listeners and watchers right now may not have tuned into that episode yet, but we might say some things that were discussed on that episode that will resurface here to, I guess, defend our thoughts on this movie. Because one thing I talked about was when a lot of these movies become cult classics.
Yeah.
And a lot of times that is not the end goal. These movies become cult classics because the people find them. The people choose them to be what they are, and then it develops a following because of that.
Yeah.
One of the worst things you can do, at least I think, is try to create a cult film before the cult has formed. I feel like that's what's happening here. I kind of feel like that with Cocaine Bear, Elizabeth Banks and screenwriter Jimmy Warden. We're using this story that we talked about as inspiration to try and create a cult film, an 80s style horror cult film. And I think they're trying to jump the gun a little bit, which is why the final product, I tweeted this out. I think a better title would have been Vanilla Bear.
Sure.
and that doesn't mean the movie is terrible. I think this is a perfectly middle of the road monster movie. It's like the perfect 2.5 out of 5-star rating I can give it on Letterboxd. But that's kind of its biggest problem. I think a movie like this should not fall in the middle. It should veer into one extreme or the other. And the fact that it doesn't is sort of why I hated the experience, because it felt like it was never quite pushing the envelope of its really potentially fun concept. And there are moments here that I think do a good job at it. There are two scenes in particular that I'm sure we'll talk about. One involving a gazebo that I actually think is really good. It's the first time I feel like there was like this real synergy between the script and the character banter and the humor there and the horror and comedy all interwoven. And it really took advantage of the whole concept there, I think, best. And there are a few performances that certainly know the kind of movie that they're in. But for the most part, this I hate using this word because I feel like it almost comes off as cheap and defensiveless, but it's kind of bland. The movie is just kind of bland. And I think that's the worst thing for a movie like this. The fact that it's not terrible, but it's not great, you don't want a movie like that to fall into that middle spectrum. You kind of want it to be not necessarily one or the other, but it needs to be extreme. And I don't think the movie is.
Yeah, this film is really interesting to talk about, right? Because on one hand, it is attempting to be fatuous schlock. That's all that it's trying to be. It wasn't trying to be anything other than that. So where does one draw the line between camp and trashiness, for the lack of a better term, and genuine criticism, because the film isn't great, but it wasn't trying to be either. And I get that. Yeah. However, the film doesn't succeed in what it's attempting to be, I think. Bland was the first word that came to mind for me as well. I'm very much there with you. And I think it comes down to two things for me. One, the humor is uneven. There are elements of it that is really good, but much of it is forced and manufactured. Granted, humor is very subjective, but I think a lot of it is stale and uninspired. And then the other problem with the film is that it's very disjointed tonally. Now, this is a horror comedy, so of course it's going to sway between levity and violence. Yeah. However, the swinging of that pendulum is absurdly jarring and not in a good way. There are a lot of moments here where the film is emphasizing its quirkiness and humor, and it's oddly reminiscent of something like Super Troopers. The style and structure of the comedy is very much in that vein, and on its own terms, I did enjoy some of it, but then it transforms into a slasher film with a black bear running around like a deranged lunatic. And those two extremes are wildly jarring. Very, very strange. That
you can do that, though. That's the thing. Like, it's been done before. You can find that merriment, and that I think you're right. I don't think that merriment exists here.
Yeah, I don't think that tonal duality works in this context, even though, again, I understand what it's trying to be in terms of it being this schlocky horror film. But then you also couple that with its tedious humor and tacky character machinations. Maybe the biggest culprit here is the film's budget and the fact that its central antagonist is a CGI bear. And so they fill in the gaps with unnecessary narrative detours that don't involve special effects, because otherwise it's asinine how often this film sways from Cocaine Bear to depict character quirks. Like, I don't care. I don't care about these characters and their quirks. Just give us a rampaging bear eating cocaine and tearing shit apart. That's all we need. But this film refuses to do that for whatever reason. And as a result, it's frustratingly drab.
And it's certainly trying to do what you're, I guess, asking it to do with regard to these characters, because we do get a lot of banter. We do get a lot of, I'll say, attempted humor with them. And I don't know if it's a performative thing. I think there are some performances here that really succeed in that humor and know the kind of movie that they're in, whereas some other performances don't do a good job at that. I think the best performance here from a human standpoint, aside from Pablo Escobar himself or herself, we find out herself specifically, I think Margot Martindale is great. I think she's the one that really knows and sells the kind of movie that she's in. I actually love the interplay that she has with Jesse Tyler Ferguson, and it made me wish that if there are two characters, human characters, to lead this, it should have been them. A monster movie like this, I mean, it's not that we need the monster to be the main character. Many of these great monster movies of the past had great characters, and this is clearly not going for Jaws, but the shark was barely existent, and that was what made that movie so great. But in this case, if you don't have something to balance it out in that way, then you find yourself waiting for what this movie promises.
Well, Jaws is trying to be a real movie.
Well, it is. But even a movie like Tremors, a movie I referenced on our last episode. Okay, that's more of a schlocky, campy. In fact, tonally, it's not too far off from something like what Cocaine Bear is trying to go for. But that you had Kevin Bacon and Fred Ward and Michael Gross doing, Reba McEntire doing really good banter. Like the timing of the dialogue and banter was so good in that movie that you didn't necessarily need a giant worm to jump out every single time. And that's what this movie is missing. It's the problem is that it's trying so hard to fill in those gaps. Well, and I could sense that it was.
Well, and that's where the disparity of the tone, I think, is a problem, because something like Tremors, the characters and the dialogue, I think, anyway, are of a piece when coupled with the schlocky action of that film and its premise.
I agree.
All of it has uniformity to it. I don't think there's any uniformity here. This is really 3 different movies. There's the Super Troopers aspect of it where, you know, in terms of the style of the comedy, it's very much mimicking that, especially with Liz and Peter. I think they walked straight out of a Super Troopers sequel and into this film. Same thing, though, also with Brooklyn Prince. The 2 kids here, Henry and Dee Dee, I believe their character names are. Mm-hmm. They very much embody that same style as well. But then there's everything with David and Eddie and Sid. They come out of a crime drug movie. And tonally speaking, this film treats it as such. Maybe not to the same dire stakes of something like Tony Montana or anything like that. It's not trying to be The Godfather, but there is a tonal change though. It shifts from slasher film. It shifts away from Super Troopers-esque comedy to become more of a drug crime movie in somewhat of a conventional sense. And thrown in the mix of all of this is a slasher villain and this bear that eats all this cocaine and is going on this rampage. And so to me, I walked in this film knowing that it was not going to be good. I understand that. I'm not criticizing the film for attempting to be that. What I'm saying is I think it fails miserably at what it's trying to be because it almost has an identity crisis. Like it doesn't know what it wants to be really.
Well, then it should have been terrible instead of being merely passable at everything it's trying to do. And that's kind of the problem here. It's like the fact that a movie like this is so middle of the road for me is actually its biggest problem, which is normally not the case of any other movie that's not trying to be this. And, you know, you talk about characters like Eddie and David and Sid who, feel like they're coming from a different movie, especially this weird backstory that the Eddie character played by Alden Ehrenreich has about like his dead wife or something. And I mean, clearly it's not trying to pull at the heartstrings, but it's a very grounded backstory for a movie like this. And
his performance though is...
for the most part, he's the best part of that whole dynamic there. But it's also a reason why I will admit that I did like the gazebo sequence that happens maybe 2/3 of the way through the film, which also incorporates the Isaiah Whitlock Jr. character of Bob, the police officer that's on the hunt for them, because it takes what are these typical archetypes from a drug crime thriller and then comedically throws them into a Cocaine Bear movie. The problem is that it takes like 80 minutes to get to that point. And that's where it becomes even more problematic. There was a moment of situational comedy that sort of pulled the rug from under your feet that I found that balance finally working. It works for maybe 7 or 8 minutes, I guess. But it did show me the potential that I think this movie could have had.
And that's a scene in a microcosm that I want to like for the reasons that you're talking about there. It seems like it's a good fit, but admittedly I found it incredibly tedious. But that could be because of how the film builds to that moment, which is immensely tedious.
The pacing of it to get to that point is certainly flawed, but I'm mostly just arguing for it in a vacuum, considering the kind of movie that this is trying to be, considering the archetypes that they set up and how they sort of flip that switch a little bit in that moment, which I think is very interesting, at least on paper.
I agree. I don't mind the premise of that sequence because it is a little subversive, I guess, given that what we had seen from Cocaine Bear was incredibly violent, sometimes very, very violent. And
we'll talk about that.
And here is a moment where it is antithetical and it is playing up that comedy. There's an interesting little ploy with David regarding some violence that isn't related to Cocaine Bear. That in and of itself is somewhat interesting. Mostly what is compelling about that sequence, though, I think, aside from some of the character banter, I did enjoy some of that. But what Pablo Escobar does in this moment, if you will, in terms of what he is what he's doing physically, I think offers some great comedy and some great levity there. So I agree with you. In a vacuum, I don't think it's entirely ineffective. It is maybe a little bit prolonged. It's a long sequence.
Yeah, you're not wrong there.
And I think I was frustrated by how this is a 90-minute movie and it felt like 3 hours. Like
kind of did. Yeah.
It was, and I think a lot of it comes down to how it sways within that pendulum, because in one moment you have Cocaine Bear completely ripping people apart, very literally. And then in the next moment you have Liz and Peter reacting as if they're in a very different movie. Like they're coming from Super Troopers, and we spend 10 minutes of them flirting with each other and taking Sarah on this hike. And it's like, what are we doing here? Is this not supposed to be about a bear ingesting cocaine and going on a rampage? You get that in bits in this film, but there are long stretches in between. Long stretches.
There are, and it's very uneven, as you say. I guess the reason why I'll defend Liz and Peter is that when I think of a movie like, well, not like Cocaine Bear specifically here, but when I think of a movie that's about a bear that ingests cocaine and goes on a killing rampage, I don't expect characters like Eddie and Sid and David. I expect characters like Peter and Liz. And that's kind of why I was able to defend them, especially their performances. I feel like the schlockiness of the concept best matches those character performance types. And it is very Super Troopers-like. I was actually reminded a lot of Wet Hot American Summer, which mostly makes sense because of Elizabeth Banks. She was in that movie. This movie opens with Jane by Jefferson Starship. So it's like, of course it's going to remind you of Wet Hot American Summer, but I don't necessarily think that comedic vibe or that style of film is out of place with something like this. The problem is that the film just doesn't commit to it.
No, I completely agree. And I think that's why I found a lot of this experience so frustrating, because we spend 5-10 minutes on these character machinations that lead to nothing. Like even, whether it be David, what we learn about Eddie, what we learn about Dee Dee and Henry, Sarah, I mean, or even what we see at the beginning of the film, which is so stupidly disingenuous, where we have a whole conversation with Elsa and Olaf. For what reason? For what reason? Why are we spending that much time on those characters? Because we know what's coming. And if this was Jaws, different story. I understand, because tonally speaking, that film is all about building character around its monster, around its violence. This film isn't trying to do that. Who cares? No. Like, the character machinations of this film, get rid of them. Get rid of all of them. And if you have to, build in these sequences because you don't have $50 million to render CGI incessantly throughout this film, I understand that you're not going to have the monster in every scene. Then just throw in character banter, make these characters compelling. I don't think many of them are. And even when it is compelling, it's often brief and completely disingenuous from everything, or disjointed, from maybe disingenuous too, from everything else around it. And the schlock at that point just becomes banal and disengaging.
And you can make the bear even more interesting. I mean, if a movie like Rubber can make a killer tire at least something interesting, then I'm sure you could do it with a bear on cocaine. But they just don't quite do that here. And it's, something you texted me when you were going to see the movie was that Brooklyn Prince is in this. You had this like exclamation that I had no idea. I had no idea you didn't know she was in this. And then I sat there and thought, oh, he's going to be so disappointed when she's barely even in the movie for reasons that the plot says. Yeah. It's like, it's nothing terrible. She's introduced and then she's hiding. That's her character arc essentially.
Yeah. I mean, I think that, again, that's part, like, the balancing act of this film is very frustrating to me because Henry and Dee Dee hardly in the film, Sarah hardly in the film, Liz and Peter, as interesting as they are, their screen time often limited, And then
I think we get mostly Eddie and David. I feel like if we're going to go by timestamp standpoint, they might be the main characters.
And
just
are they
based on how
that
much
compelling? Are they compelling characters to you? Because I found
not
them
really. No, I did like
mundane.
Alden Ehrenreich's performance, but I didn't like the character that much.
Yeah, the writing of those characters. Again, I'm not asking for nuance. I'm just asking to be interesting, and I found them campy.
I just wanted to laugh.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think that's my problem with it. The humor needs to be more biting because this is meant to be silly. It is meant to be fatuous in a good way.
Yeah.
And I found this mostly anemic and uninspired in terms of the humor. And and that really needs to carry the weight here because of course it's like these characters aren't going to be written with nuance. It might also help though if you reduce the amount of storylines going on here because there's like 3 different storylines happening simultaneously. So we're always constantly cutting from one to the next. And as a result, Henry and Dee Dee, barely part of this film. Then there's Ranger Liz and Peter, who, again, 5-10 minutes of screen time.
I know. It's so stop and go because every time that like those 2 pairings you mentioned, Liz and Peter, Liz and Peter, and then you have Dee Dee and Henry, the 2 children here. Every time, or at least in the moments when they're being introduced, I thought, okay, this can carry the movie. This might be able to carry the movie. And it's like, nope, no, not interested. Let's move on to something else.
And that's, I think you make a great point because if it was just Peter and Liz, I'm in. Yeah. I'm in. If they're carrying the weight of this film and they're on screen for the bulk of it, I would have had a great time with this film. Or similarly with Dee Dee and Henry, I found them charming. There are elements to their characters as kids that are a little jarring, kind of in a good way. Like it's a little bold and audacious what they're asking kids to do.
I need to bring up one scene, and I'm gonna slightly spoil this a little bit. It happens in the beginning because it's a scene that it elicited a negative emotional response for me because it's very bold and very distasteful, quite literally distasteful. It goes there, and I appreciate that.
I agree.
We see 2 children discover this cocaine. The first thing they try and do is eat it. I mean, like literally eat it. And I sat there thinking that is just mean-spirited and ugly and vile and good. I think more of that could have done the movie a lot of favors.
Yeah,
and at the same time, these 2 children, as cocky and as troublemaking as they are in the moment, they're still charming, and that's a hard balance to get right. So to somewhat dispose of them from the narrative is so unfortunate. Then
I completely agree, and I don't know what your audience was like, but a lot of what Christian Convery, I'm not sure if I'm saying that right, but his performance
Henry,
as Henry,
he elicited a lot of laughs. I think
same, absolutely.
As far as the human characters in this movie, the one that got the most laughs from my audience were Christian Convery as Henry and Margot Martindale as Ranger Liz.
Yeah, that was my audience as well. Yeah, Henry evoked quite a bit of laughter in my audience. Brooklyn Prince, I think, is very good when she's on screen. She's just on screen for like 3 minutes, which is very unfortunate because I was so excited to see her again. But that dynamic was great. And you're right. When they're eating the cocaine, it will elicit, especially if you're a parent, but you don't have to be so. Brendan just admitted so. Yeah. It does evoke this vile thing. Yeah. But there is a payoff to it later on in the film. There's a
payoff. And at least it elicited an emotional response. And that's there was something about it that it stuck with me.
And admittedly, I found it kind of funny. Like the performance element of it, the dynamic between them is so charming. And it is funny because of their naivete and their innocence. It comes off quite humorous, even if it is distasteful. And there's a great payoff. Yeah. As when Henry and Sarah are talking about it, it's kind of funny how she's able to kind of figure it out. It's really great. So if it's not going to be Peter and Liz, then let's let them carry the bulk of the film. I would have enjoyed that, but instead it's those storylines. There's everything with David and Eddie and Sid. And then we haven't even mentioned there are these 3 teenagers that show up halfway through the film. For what reason, God knows, other than to be victims.
I forgot about them, actually.
But they're literally just on screen to be victims. That's it. But again, like there's like these weird character machinations with them that I don't know why they're written there. There's also the 2 ambulance, service men that show up and women, I guess. And again, like there's I
found that so frustrating. I know a lot of people have been citing the ambulance scene as perhaps the highlight of the movie, and I don't agree. I think it's the moment where you see the cocaine bear, the titular bear, wreak the most visual havoc. I mean, it's the goriest scene of the movie, arguably. But I was thinking there, like to what extent? You know, it frustrates me when gore and blood is simply used as the comedic punchline. Mm-hmm. And it almost seems as though like the violence there is only there to mask the fact that there's nothing else comedically supporting it. Because these 2 characters at the end of it, they're nothing characters to this, whether it be comedically or whatever. And it's just frustrating that we're using these superficial things to mask how plain the movie actually is. Now, granted, my theater ate it up. Like when that happened and it was bloody and gory and everything that you would want from a movie like this, they loved it. So I guess it's working for enough people. But I sat there thinking, can it be more than just that? This feels like a Band-Aid like to try and mask how plain the movie actually is to me.
And isn't it just weird? I know we've talked about this before, especially when we did our Scream retrospective. What was that, last year or whenever that was?
Yes. Yeah.
It's just so weird to me. And I've become a fan of horror over these last 10, 15 years.
You embraced it. You got the thick skin. You tried to learn from it, and you've become a fan.
So there's a lot of horror that I really love. So when I say this, I'm not pointing the finger at anybody or trying to elevate myself as being better, because that's not the case. But it is a little strange to me that we as a society embrace slasher films like this, where we love to see innocent people being slaughtered for really no good reason. And there are characters here that are a little bit more satisfying because they themselves come off as vile and come off as distasteful. But then there's the flip side of that coin. And audiences eat this up, but that's not how we are in real life, though. Like, you hear these stories in real life, especially when we're talking about innocent victims. That's not our response. Yet we go to the theater and we're like, yeah, kill them all.
That's the thing. Like,
so strange to me.
Where is the separator then?
Yeah,
are we cheering on the people getting mutilated, or are we cheering on the mutilation itself? And I think that's an interesting question when it comes to these movies, right? Because I feel like with that ambulance scene specifically, I feel like all we're trying to laugh at, or all the movie's trying to get us to laugh at, is the mutilation. And that's it. And that's where I have a little problem with it.
Yeah.
I mean, it wouldn't be a problem for me if we were, laughing at the type of character receiving said mutilation. And it's not that they have to be a bad person. It just has to be a character that we found comedic or endearing in some way, for the services of that movie, to elicit that right emotional response. But if we're simply cheering someone's hand getting bitten off because it's someone's hand getting bitten off, that's kind of weird.
It
if
is,
you ask me.
Especially when we're talking about characters that, given who we know them, and some of these characters we don't know that well, but dramatically on screen, they've done nothing to make us want to root for their demise. They come off innocent because they've done nothing wrong, but they are victims in these kind of movies. And I think that's probably why I am drawn to horror films and slasher films that have some sort of thematic potency to them. I think of something like Candyman, whether you're talking about the remake or the original. There's like fascinating things going on in that movie to make sense of the slashing. Of course, the Scream series, not the last one, but in general, the franchise has done a good job of this as well. I mean, there's many that you can bring up that have a purpose for having that sort of killing. Like the film is making sense of it in some sort of way. A lot of these schlocky slasher films that are just there for cheap thrill, admittedly, I struggle to embrace them because of this very notion. Like we're supposed to cheer and root for gore and violence toward people, toward characters that are just innocent bystanders. And there's something about how I perceive the world that doesn't, I guess, coexist with that, if that makes sense.
No, it makes sense.
Those two things are juxtaposing each other. So it's hard for me to walk in these films, see that, and experience that as joy, because I don't see that as joy. In my real life, I don't see that as joy. I don't get entertainment value out of that. But, and again, some films, like I like being challenged in films, though. I'm not going in for films to validate who I am as a person. This film, though, and a lot of slasher films like this, they're not trying to challenge you. They're just trying to make, again, this film is meant to be dumb. It's meant to be fatuous. It's meant to be silly and entertaining. So I can't give it credit for challenging me when that's not what it's trying to do.
That's not its goal. But even so, let's look back at other movies that may have done something similar. I mentioned a movie like Tremors, for instance. We also reference very briefly a movie like Deep Blue Sea on that podcast episode. Okay, that's a movie that's not taking itself seriously as well. But when characters die in that movie, it's not that you care about them. We're not asking to care about these characters, but there needs to be a reason for their demise in the service of that story and the tone it's going for. Mm-hmm. We're not just, in those movies, I don't think we're just cheering on the demise. We're cheering on maybe the ramifications or the lead up to that demise and how it and how it relates to that person. I think Tremors is another great example. There are characters who die who don't even speak in that movie, and yet somehow I feel something of a comedic response. And I think it's mostly due to how Kevin Bacon and Fred Ward react to those moments. And that's the other. There's no reaction shots here. There's no characters here to play the straight man, if you want to call it that, for us to sort of experience it through those eyes. And I think a consistency and a through line would have really done this movie some good. So in that sense, all we're doing is cheering on blood and guts. I mean, in that case, Saw is a comedy. I mean, it's basically what this is telling me.
Yeah, absolutely. And Saw, again, is one of those films that I think is trying to do something interesting with its formula and its material. The sequels, maybe not so much, but that original Saw, I think, was doing something interesting. But yeah, you make a great point. And I think the difference between something like this film and the one that you bring up, Deep Blue Sea, is that film ultimately, I think, in a great way, plays into the formula where it, first of all, it gives us interesting characters that we feel compelled by. And as a result, there are characters, that you are, I guess, rooting for or hoping to survive, like the LL Cool J character, for example. I found him so charming and compelling.
I hope he got a new pet bird.
I know that the whole film, I'm like, I hope he survives. And so like, there's a rooting interest there. And with Samuel L. Jackson, like he's kind of playing both sides of the line a little bit. So when he's taken out of the film, there is a little bit of, oh my gosh, that was exciting. And, again, you don't want to see people, become victims in that way. But the film kind of, because of how they built up that character to be, there is a little bit of satisfaction there. Or at least it's not as cumbersome as other examples. And so the fun of that film, the characters of that film ultimately outweigh this broader notion that we're talking about here. Whereas bringing it back to Cocaine Bear, specifically, I can talk about this in specifics. And I guess this is a little bit of a spoiler, so heads up if you haven't seen the film.
Okay.
The opening with Elsa and Olaf. this is quintessential to what I'm talking about, right? Because you have a couple that the film is building up through their conversation as characters that we are endeared by. They're about to get married and they're having this endearing conversation, and who's going to be the band at the wedding, and I want kids, and you're going to be a great father one day. And the film does this so disingenuously because we know what's around the corner and we know what's about to happen. And then the film has quote unquote fun pulling that rug out from under you. And that's where I struggle because, again, the film is having fun with death and carnage in a way that completely reverts against who I am internally. And unlike something like Deep Blue Sea, I don't think the film is able to overcome that with its fun and entertainment value and offering up other characters where I can look past that. You know, I can look past it in something like Deep Blue Sea. Here, I struggle because the film fails in all of those same ways.
The problem is that the dialogue feels too passive, too much like a first draft of sorts. Because if the film is meant to be this sleight of hand to introduce this bickering couple in a loving way that seems like it's straight from every horror movie to make you feel some sort of tension and fear for these people, play into the comedy a bit more. It feels like a very passive and first draft kind of way to set up the stage in that way.
It's too genuine. It's too grounded in that opening scene.
It's and I think that supports your argument that the film just doesn't quite know what it wants to be. And I was really rooting for Elizabeth Banks here. I mean, I admittedly haven't seen her Charlie's Angels, which I hear is not terrible, but I actually think Pitch Perfect 2 is really good.
I agree. I agree.
There are times I think I've seen all three of those movies. I actually sang in a cappella groups when I was in college, so I had a bit of a nostalgic tie to that. But I weirdly think Pitch Perfect 2 is the best of the three. It's kind of the most hangouty of the three, even despite some of the grand places that the film takes you. But I think she proved that she's good at handling that sort of comedic timing and that banter. And I think that would have fit really well here in Cocaine Bear, but I think the banter here is just really off. The problem is strictly around character.
And
it
tone.
Really is.
The mismanagement of tone. Because if Elsa and Olaf, which admittedly, funny that they're picking those names, that was not accidental.
But see, that play into that a little bit.
I mean, agree. Make a joke about not letting go, or I melted.
You don't have to say the word Frozen. You don't have to say you love the movie Frozen.
But have some fun.
Be a little comedically cryptic with it.
I completely agree. Instead, the banter is grounded. It's grounded emotionally. It wants us to feel something. You know, why? Like, why? Yeah. Like we know we're about to get in the schlock, and it does. Like, that whole sequence ends with schlocky gore, and I found it very off-putting. Like, just have some sort of tonal consistency. You can't have that moment and then the next moment is something straight out of Super Troopers, and the next moment we're getting into slasher film again. Then there's these three teenagers that show up out of nowhere. Then all of a sudden it's a drug movie, and it's like, what are we doing here? Like, it's too discombobulated.
The fact that we've been talking for half the length of this movie, and I think we proved, JD, we're not big fans of it.
No. But I'm trying. Like, I tried. Like, I genuinely went into this wanting to like it.
Yeah.
I probably should have stated that at the beginning of all of this. Especially when I started talking about why it didn't work for me. I really did want this to succeed. I was looking forward to the movie. It looked absurd and ridiculous. In fact, I had some friends question when I showed them the trailer. They were like, why do you want to see that movie? I was like, it looks fun. Like, it looks silly and dumb, and that's all I really wanted out of it. And it was all of that, but for the wrong reasons. It wasn't fun for me.
Everything about it for me was just, it was partially there. It's partially dumb, partially funny, partially thrilling. And that's like the worst thing to say about any movie like this. Like, I wanted it to be awesome or terrible. That's but I think movies like this should fall into that spectrum, not the middle ground. And that's kind of the worst thing to say about it, honestly.
Honestly, I think the script here is trying to do too much.
I agree.
Which is kind of ironic because this film isn't trying to do anything of meaning. Mm-hmm. And I don't know what Jimmy Warden's intentions were when he was writing this script. Maybe he spent 5 minutes on it. I don't know.
Yeah.
It certainly seems like that's probably the case. But like, I think he tried to, maybe the studios asked him like, no, we can't, it can't be that simple and silly. We have to do more. So let's throw in because it's based off of this guy who was dropping cocaine into the forest. We have to have like a drug storyline here.
Right.
You don't.
Right.
You really don't. Like, you could strip all of that out, and it would have taken Ray Liotta out of this movie. God bless him. But I don't think any of that adds anything to this movie.
It doesn't matter. And honestly, I think it would have been more fitting to remove it, because the way that the real life Thornton's character arc crystallizes in that plane is complete proof and a visual proof that none of it matters. It doesn't need to be
exactly
here.
Like that. I thought was a pitch perfect way, pun intended, to
nice
crystallize, because it's great. Like, there's a lot of fun when he's in the plane, he's done with the cocaine, and then it ends the way it does with some great physical comedy. Mm-hmm. That's all you really need.
Yeah.
But yet when push comes to shove, and again, I love Ray Liotta. I don't think this is on him. This is more on the writing.
I think he's pretty good in the movie. It's just more about the character and how it's juggled in here.
The problem is he's coming from Goodfellas. Like, he's coming from that movie. Like, he treats this material seriously.
Well, especially given the backstory too.
Well, that's what I mean. Like, these guys are on me. Like, we have to find this. Like, they're going to come after me. And they're going to come after you.
And
they're going to come after you and your son. Like, we got to do something. Like, there's nothing schlocky or fun about his character. It is very serious. It's like, why you can't have that when 30 minutes ago you were trying to mimic Super Troopers. Like, what are you doing here?
Yeah.
Like that. And so that to me is the problem. It's too, and again,
it's
I
on cocaine.
How
it's
this
all over
sounds, because it's too messy of a movie. And again, I understand this film is not trying to be anything of meaning. I get that.
In many ways, maybe it's not messy enough.
And maybe it is more grounded than it needed to be throughout a lot of the film.
Yeah.
When it just needed to embrace that schlock, embrace that fatuousness, get silly and ridiculous. When it gets insanely silly, that's when it's at its best, but it only does that a quarter of the time here.
Yeah. I think the best way I can, visually explain my feelings on this movie, and really just what we're talking about here right now, it's the bear itself, the bear herself, and the visual effects of the bear. Mm-hmm. You brought this up earlier. It's really just a CGI bear wreaking havoc is really all it is. And the visual effects here are really, really bad. And it's the reason why they're really bad is not because they're really bad. The problem is that they're not bad enough to be funny, but they're not good enough to be convincing either. It's like in the bear. The look of that bear doesn't look much worse than most major blockbusters we get. It kind of looks like it could have come from a Jurassic World movie. But see, that means the effects are kind of okay.
Yeah.
But that's why they're really bad. It's make this the most, why couldn't it look like Yogi Bear or something like that?
Well, and that's, I think maybe tone is my biggest issue with it. I think there's credence to what you're saying, 100%. But I think of the moment you brought up earlier at the gazebo where, what is it doing? It's being silly. Very silly. It opens up, and we see this in the trailer, right? Where it opens up the cocaine and it's rolling around like it's from a cartoon.
It's like it's doing a little ballet number with it.
Yeah. And then at the end of the film, when it's searing its soul into the Sid character, it is vicious and out of the Leo DiCaprio movie, out of The Revenant. You have two versions of the bear in this film as well.
That's a good point. I sometimes didn't feel like there was character consistency with the bear. The bear needed more character development.
The character machinations for the bear were even uneven. Can we just have some consistency? That's all I'm asking.
Just get the bear right.
Yeah, it should have just been 90 minutes of the bear tearing people apart. And to your point, and I mentioned this earlier as well, if the problem is budget and we can't afford to have the bear in every scene, okay, well, let the effects be really bad. Don't spend that much time on it. Like,
that could have been really funny. That could have been really funny.
Yeah.
If the bear looked like one of the sharks from Sharknado or something like that.
Just do that. And then it just kind of plays into the comedy more. So I don't know. It's frustrating. I've spent a lot of this conversation harping on those frustrations. I do want to emphasize, I did not completely loathe this experience. There are good things here. There are moments where I laughed. I really did genuinely enjoy its Super Troopers knockoff that it was doing. Like when it was trying to be that movie, I was having fun. I thought it was good. I liked the Dee Dee and Henry stuff. I think I've spent a lot of time on my frustrations because of the promise of the film and how much fun I did have with it when I was enjoying it. So like I just, my frustration just heightened the more the film went on. So that's why I spent time on it. And anyway, do you have any final thoughts here?
No, it's just like, it's weird to say that if I'm going to give this movie, or if I would grade a movie like this, a 5 out of 10, 2.5 out of 5 stars, whatever it is, that makes me want to give it like 1 out of 5 because like this movie shouldn't fit squarely in the middle. Like that's such a problem for a movie like this. And that's why I keep talking about how it's very passive and very plain, and why even the visual effects of the bear don't even match up with that. It's not bad enough to be bad, but it's also not good enough to be good. That's the wrong thing to say for a movie like this, and it really does feel like Banks and Warden and the film itself, they were really trying to create the cult following before it could form on its own organic terms. And I think that's the worst thing you can do for a movie like this.
Yeah, I completely agree. As far as some final thoughts, I want to echo that, Alden Ehrenreich is in this movie. And similar to Brooklyn Prince, it's great to see him because he hasn't been in as much since, the solo film he did. What was that? 2016, 15, something like that?
I think it may have been 2018, actually. Didn't that come out? Was that before or after The Last Jedi?
Before? I want to say before. I could be wrong.
I have no idea what time is anymore.
I know.
2018. I've just looked it up. It's 2018.
Okay,
yeah,
so
it was
around
after The Last
time.
Jedi. Yeah.
Yeah. Say what you will about the film. It was not, Alden Ehrenreich was not the reason that film
is not the problem, right?
Faltered. I really like him as a performer. I think he's been unfairly blacklisted because of that film. I want to see him doing more, and I think he's going to end up doing some more. If I remember correctly, I looked up his IMDb not that long ago, a few months ago, I think, and I think he's got some projects coming up. I do hope to see more of him because I do think he's very good. I hope he's able to separate himself from the Star Wars thing. And so it was good to see him here. I didn't really care for the character of Eddie, but mostly because it's overwritten,
right?
Which is weird to say.
That's a weird thing to say.
But it's true. Like, I think they're asking him to do way too much. Admittedly though, it's weird because the character is overwritten. His performance, though, is a little schmaltzy and sappy, but in like a heightened way, like in a fun, heightened way. So
I agree.
Where the writing does a disservice, I think his performance does a good job of remembering what kind of movie he's in. Even when Ray Liotta, as his father's like, no, this is serious. We got to take this serious. And he's like, he's not playing up to that tone. So I do appreciate that. And I love Ray Liotta. I think he's doing what he's asked to do. So it's not a knock on him at all. God bless him. And it was great to see Ray Liotta one last time as well. So again, he's not an issue with this film as well. So I just wanted a little bit more consistency. I wanted it to be less writing, more silliness. This film was campy. It was schlocky at times, but not enough. I don't think it did enough in that regard.
I'm with you. I think that's its biggest problem, honestly.
All right. Well, with that said, hit us up on social media, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. Let us know if you agree or disagree with anything we had to say here. Email us InSessionFilm@gmail.com. We have a written review of this up as well at InSessionFilm.com that you can go and check out. And hopefully when they make Cocaine Bear 2, because that's the world we live in now.
Isn't it a different animal this time? Isn't it like Cocaine Shark or something like that?
Yeah, that sounds about right.
I'm actually not even kidding. I thought I heard something about that.
Well, it wouldn't surprise me if they do a sequel. And I think you're right. I think I did hear something about it. See, I would avoid shark because we've seen many shark movies.
We have. You're right.
The fun thing about this premise is that it doesn't have to be beholden to anything conventional because it's cocaine. So you can the premise is, any animal snorts it and it's a monster, right? We've seen sharks do something different. A jaguar, a camel.
Does it have to be an apex predator?
No.
What if it's like a chipmunk wreaking havoc?
Now, that would be interesting. A squirrel. Yeah. Do something along those
squirrel.
Exactly. Like you're taking away his nuts and he goes on a rampage. Like, yeah, I mean, the options are endless. Do something different. Don't do shark. Don't do don't do something we've seen before.
Yeah.
Do something different. I like camel. I think that would be interesting.
Cocaine camel. That actually rolls off the tongue nicely. The double C's there.
Exactly. So I'm trying to think of something off the cuff here that
Cocaine cat.
Cocaine cat, yeah. At any rate, we can think of some other options. Like just stray away from convention. That's all that I'm saying.
I like it. Yeah, I like it.
At any rate, thanks, Brendan, for joining me. Do you have any final thoughts before we get out of here?
No, don't see Cocaine Bear. Well, if you have, I hope you enjoyed it. We certainly didn't. But if we do get sequels to this, stick to non-convention. Cocaine goldfish. Cocaine...
Yeah.
It doesn't have to be cocaine. You could do something completely different. But yeah, other than that...
Giraffe. Nope. Cocaine giraffe. Swinging its neck left and right.
Yeah.
Just destroying people.
And go after Zach Galifianakis for killing that one in The Hangover Part 3.
Exactly. Yeah. I think that would be fun. So
yeah, but it's wacky. It's wacky. And
exactly.
I'm here for wacky. When this movie got wacky, which was not nearly enough, but there were moments when it did, I was on board. And I would have loved to see more of that.
I agree. And bring Brooklyn Prince back. Have her do more in the next one.
Yeah, and not just hide in a cave.
Not just hide in a cave. Absolutely.
Yeah, we didn't even talk about Kerry Russell, who plays her mom in this. And again, she falls into that same spectrum of she's fine in the movie, and that's why I didn't really like her performance. It straddles that line too much in the in-between. And
that's where, again, the writing, like, I understand why she's reacting the way she does because she's a mom and instinctively she's going to react that way. But why you don't have to have the kids in peril to begin with for her to react that way. Like, you're doing too much here. Like, we don't need
I love how we're at the end of the episode. We're still going. Cocaine Bear. I think you could tell this movie frustrated us.
This is why we had to reshift the format of the podcast, because we just spent an hour on Cocaine Bear. And on the old format, we would have had another 90 minutes of content to go. Like,
oh my gosh.
The
fact that we're done is actually kind of a relief. Man, this new format's really making us it's making us spoiled, honestly.
I know, it is. At any rate, Cocaine Bear, go see it. Let us know if you agree or disagree. We will see you all next time on the InSession Film Podcast. Cocaine elephant? Question mark?
I like that.
Need weekend plans? Check out what's happening at your local Lowe's. Weekending at Lowe's gives you and your family the opportunity to make us your weekend destination. Stop by for free workshops, events, and activities for everyone to enjoy. We're getting active with fun local events like our upcoming Lowe's Bucket Ball Challenge and Kids Workshop. Visit Lowe's.com/events for our full event lineup. Count on Lowe's for all of your home improvement needs. And now, activities in your community with Weekending at Lowe's.